Hi, Lowell Shepherd here, Pacific Solo in the Never Too Late Academy, on board my boat, Wahine Gipsy 42 here in Okinawa. I'm delighted to introduce to you Francis Hawkings, already known among serious sailors. He's traveled over 35,000 miles on his boat, Plainsong. He's also sailed other boats he has owned and chartered boats. And I first heard of him when he was making a solo crossing from Hawaii to Japan. At one point, we were within about 20 miles of each other. He arrived during COVID. We began to correspond. We're introduced by a mutual friend called Kirk Patterson. He cruised Japan for a time, and I had the pleasure of finally meeting him. We had some meals together, and I visited him on his boat. So this is just a raw interview of him just answering some questions I'm asking. If you want to read about his solo passage from Hawaii, where he had to face storms, rigging problems, etc., you can find that in articles about him and by him in Yachting World, Royal Cruising Club, and elsewhere. Just search for Francis Hawkings, but also put links in the description. He's a true gentleman of the seas, a seasoned sailor, unflappable, a charming man, and I enjoyed every moment I spent with him, and I know you will as well.
Well, the boat's called Plainsong, which is Gregorian chant. It's the monastic music from the Gregorian monks and nuns too, actually, from the Middle Ages in Europe. And that mindset expresses a point of view of man's place in the universe, where man is very small. Mankind is overpowered by forces that are much greater than that mankind can control, and Plainsong sort of seeks redemption and forgiveness from a higher power, essentially. And although I don't think of this boat in that highly spiritual higher power God sort of way, I think that point of view of a small human, modest in relation to the elements, is very appropriate for a boat. And the word itself, the plain part of the word is about modesty, the song part is about joy and creativity, and I don't know why, but it just happened that the boat became called Plainsong. My name is Francis Hawkings. I'm British by birth, although I've lived in the United States since 1987. And I was brought up in the UK in the north of England, and I sailed dinghies as a boy. My father taught me to sail dinghies, particularly in Scotland. We used to go for summer holidays in Scotland, and we would always take a sailing dinghy with us. And when in my teens, I started crewing for a retired naval captain who lived in Scotland. And he taught me both how to race and how to cruise. And for many years, we did both together on the west coast of Scotland. And then later, when I was in college, high school and college actually, I could sail on the south coast of England. And when I was first working, I worked in London and went down on weekends to crew on racing boats in the Solent. And I had dinghies all this time until I was in my early 20s when I bought my first cruising boat, which was a Contessa 26, right, which is a very pretty, very seaworthy, sea-kindly, long-keel, traditional boat, modeled originally on the folk boat. And it was the same type of boat that the wonderful Tanya Abe sailed around the world as a teenager, as a fantastic story in the 1980s, I guess. I'm not quite sure exactly which decade it would be now, but anyway. And that was a great starter boat. Her name was Samphire of Hurst.
Right, Samphire of Hurst.
Not a name that I chose.
Right.
I responded to an ad in a magazine when I was looking for a boat, and it turned out it was actually my cousin who was selling the boat.
Oh, coincidentally.
Coincidentally, yeah. So I bought his boat, and I had it for about 5 years or so, until eventually I was in grad school and had to sell the boat because I didn't have any money.
Right.
But it was a wonderful boat. I sailed it my first season. I was in the south of England when I bought it. I sailed it late in the year up the west coast of Ireland and up to Scotland, and then I based it in Scotland ever since, for the following years. Sailed back around the Irish west coast of Scotland, the Faroes, around the top of Scotland, down through the Caledonian Canal, all the kind of really great, not too far away cruising that you can do in that part of the world. And then some years later, when I was working again, I was living in the United States, and it was time to buy a new boat, and I bought this boat. Some people just, have a drive to sail,
Right.
and I'm certainly, for better or for worse, I'm one of those. And I've always wanted to do long distance cruising. At that point, I'd done one transatlantic as a crew.
Okay. Right.
On a nice wooden boat, but I hadn't done any long distance cruising as a skipper. And I'd done a little bit of chartering. I chartered in Alaska once, and I chartered in British Columbia once. But there's something different about owning your own boat.
Mm-hmm.
And since I had always owned my own dinghies, and then I owned my first little cruising boat, kind of like, owning your own boat just came naturally. And I didn't want to leave it too late. And by that stage I was working. And so, I could just about afford it again. And so in that sense, it was time to, start over again. It was built in a very small boatyard in Salcombe in Devon in England. The boat is a Tradewind 35, which is a boat designed in the 1980s, maybe even designed earlier than that, I'm not quite sure, and built in very small numbers per year over a period of years. I believe about 75 were built, I'm not quite sure. I know that this is hull number 45, and they went on building quite a few more after this. But to put the boat in context and the design in context, this is so retro that it qualifies for the Golden Globe race. Wow. There aren't many boats that are old enough to do that. And this is what this is. And I was brought up in the long keel tradition. I didn't know a huge amount about yacht design at that time, and a long keel was fine with me. I think in retrospect, now yacht design has moved on, and I'm not sure I probably would not buy a long keel vessel today if I was starting over. That said, a long keel vessel has a very heavy displacement. This is a 35 footer, but she displaces 10 tons. And, like long keel, heavy displacement, it's got many virtues, but it has some drawbacks as well. And I think you can probably find a sort of middle of the road design that keeps some of the virtues of long keel and picks up some of the virtues of more modern designs. The guy who owned the boatyard was about my age, very, very nice guy. He and I became great friends. And later, after the boat had been launched and I had shipped it out to California, about 3 or 4 years later than that, he came and joined me in Chile, and we sailed around Cape Horn together in the boat that he had built. So that was really quite it was a great thing for both of us to do, I think. Well, that was part of a 2-year cruise.
Right, okay.
I had the boat built in 92, shipped it to California in 93, quit my job in 97, and went off sailing for 2 years.
Okay.
And initially, when the boat had first got to California, I sailed it out to Hawaii as a kind of shakedown. That was in 93, 94. And in 97, I sailed the boat from California to French Polynesia, spent about 3 months in French Polynesia, and then sailed the boat from Tahiti to Chile. And I was very fortunate because it was an El Nino year, and that course is basically against the trade winds. So normally you have to sail south, and then you pick up westerlies when you're sufficiently far south, and you take the westerlies into South America. But because it was El Nino year, the trade winds were very weak, and by chance I was able to sail actually from Tahiti to Pitcairn, and from Pitcairn to Easter Island, and then from Easter Island to mainland Chile. And Easter Island is just an extraordinary place to visit, so that was a really wonderful piece of luck. And then so I went into Chile at Puerto Montt, which is the north end of the Patagonian channels, and spent, I think it was about 4 or 5 months in Chile, sailing all the way down through the Patagonian channels, arriving in the Beagle Channel around Christmas time, 1997. and then spent about a month roughly around the Beagle Channel, and in that time dipped around Cape Horn with Brian and with Catherine as well, who was sailing with me at that time, Catherine Thornhill as she then was. Then Brian and I sailed the boat up the east coast of South America in the Atlantic to Mar del Plata in Argentina. And I then paused in Argentina for about 5 months altogether, waiting for the seasonal winds to change, and then sailed the boat on up through Brazil. This was coast hopping all the way up until a little bit north of Salvador in Bahia, and then made a passage from a little bit north of Salvador to Trinidad. And that was kind of the end of the continuous cruising, which was about just under 2 years, 21 months I think it was, or something like that. And then I based the boat in the Caribbean for about a year, lent it to some friends, and between them and me, we gradually moved it up the islands to Antigua, and then I sailed, funnily enough, with the cousin from whom I had bought Samphire in the first place, from Antigua to Florida, and eventually shipped the boat back from Florida to California because I didn't have time to. Well, it's a long trek actually to sail it back the other way through the Panama Canal and back to California. So that she got back in I think either 2001, I guess it was, maybe it was 2002, and then sort of went a little bit dormant for best part of 20 years. Just coastal sailing. I didn't do very much to the boat because I knew I was going to do a big refit for another longer cruise, and there was no point in doing anything in the interim. And then I was lucky enough to retire in 2020, and so I started preparing the boat for a longer cruise to set off in 2020. In that 20-year period was that I learned to sail the boat by myself.
Okay.
Because I got much more picky about who I sailed with.
Right.
And I found that oftentimes I would take a friend out sailing, and it'd be wonderful to sail with my great friend, and within 2 hours, poor thing, they'd be throwing up over the side, we'd head back into harbour, whatever, and I wasn't there was no real need to go out sailing with strangers, and my wife unfortunately gets terribly seasick and really can't even be on the dock, let alone the boat, so she didn't want to come, and which also meant I didn't sail so much because I used to travel for work a great deal. I couldn't be away all week on business and then be away all weekend sailing. I didn't want to be. So I learned to sail by myself, and that stood me in really good stead subsequently. And I think I learned a lot about the boat and kind of change how I wanted to prepare the boat for a second voyage.
Right, and can you give us an insight into what that was?
Sure. Well, so one of the things was sail plan,
right?
Where I had a second jib made. This is a cutter,
right?
So the larger jib at the front is a Yankee cut, high cut Yankee. I had an identical sail made out of a lightweight cloth that you can, basically out of spinnaker material, that you can launch out of a sock and then go wing on wing with like a twin pole thing. So that was a good change for the rig for downwind, tradewind sailing. I have a lightweight kind of Genoa, also made out of spinnaker material that you can launch from a sock. In both cases, so you can do it by yourself under control. And I had that recut so that it works much better. Then there was a whole thing of updating the boat to modern technology, which was fairly obvious. Sort of time had passed and the boat needed to be updated. But I would say the second big theme after the sail plan was manageability. So by the time I was setting off, I was 67, I guess, and I can't handle stuff. I can't handle stuff as heavy as I used to be able to handle stuff. And so I looked at things in quite some detail, and in a few instances I scaled down. For example, my second anchor used to be really heavy, and I realized this is actually too heavy for me to handle now. In the old days, I used to think heavy is good. The boat's heavy, heavy is good, chain is good, the thicker the rope, the better it is. But now I've realized, man, if I can't handle that, I'm never going to use it, so it's pointless. So I redid my anchors and ended up with less weight, like less heavy individual anchors, and generally reviewed the whole boat as to what's manageable and what isn't. I would say those are probably the main big themes, along with just a really good inspection from front to back. Is everything in good shape? Does anything need to be replaced? I replaced all the rigging. There was nothing wrong with it, but it was 20 years old or 25 years old or something, so I just replaced that.
So when you set out to Hawaii on that first leg, you set out with confidence and in the boat and yourself. And
well, I think I always set out with a little bit of anxiety. I don't know if I'm a wimp or if it's just human, but I always feel a little bit anxious before a long voyage because you just don't know what's going to happen. But the boat performed very well on the way to Hawaii. There was very few glitches. We had a fast passage, pretty windy all the way in the winter, and it was good. I did have a rigging failure even with my new rigging in between Hawaii and Japan, but fortunately I was able to mend it as I went along, so it didn't turn out to be catastrophic. And my original plan had been to go to the Philippines, where I've spent a lot of time in the past on business. I love the Philippines very much. But I was at an exhibit in Chicago in 2017, and they had a particular feature on the island of Naoshima in the inland sea in the Seto Naikai. And I thought, that looks absolutely fantastic and fascinating. Why don't I go to Japan on the way to the Philippines? So that's how it came about that I sailed to Japan. And so my plan was to sail to Japan, then sail to Vladivostok in Russia, and after the following year, and then come down through Korea and on down to the Philippines. But that got derailed by a couple of things. First, it was derailed by the pandemic, and then second, as time passed, it was derailed by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So I was like, I'm not going to Vladivostok anytime Putin's around, thank you very much. In 2020, it was a little hard to get into places because of the pandemic, and I was able to sail from California to Hawaii with my son-in-law, which was really a wonderful thing to be able to do, leaving LA in February and getting to Hawaii right at the beginning of March, I think it was. And my son-in-law Michael had a British passport, and at that time American passports were still allowed into Japan, but almost no other nationality, so he couldn't come with me. And since pretty much no one else could get in either, and very few people could even get to America to join me or get to Hawaii to join me or whatever, I was like, okay, well, better do it by myself. So I spent about a month altogether in Hawaii, and then left Hawaii at the end of March 2020 and set sail for Japan, not knowing exactly what my port of entry was going to be, because as different prefectures closed or declared or undeclared states of emergency, ports of entry would close or open again.
I'm going to interject here just for a moment because Francis and I did not discuss his actual passage from Hawaii to Japan, which was fraught with difficulties and challenges. Major storm, rigging failure, and the uncertainty of where he could make landfall. I'll put a link in the description where you can read about that account and how he dealt with foul weather along the way.
In the end, I ended up going to Tanua, which is southwest of Osaka, a little bit north of Wakayama, which turned out to be a really wonderful place. I loved it, and based the boat there for longer than I had intended, and made a lot of friends, and it really transformed my whole experience of cruising in Japan and of Japan as a whole. In that first year, when I first arrived in May, it was hard to cruise. The harbors around the inland sea were closing. You couldn't get into places. I did manage to do about 10 or 12 days of just a mini cruise by myself, but then everything was closing up, and I went back to Tanua and did a little bit of land tourism. I went to Kyoto, and there were no foreign tourists there, literally none, because nobody was allowed to enter the country. I'd been able to get in because I'd been at sea for 6 weeks, but nobody was allowed to fly in or come in by ferry. And so, although the museums and the indoor places were closed in Kyoto, the temples and the shrines were open, and I would be literally on my own in these wonderful places. It's a way of experiencing them that would never have been possible, is never normally possible. I'd been away from home for 5 months by the time we got to the end of June 2020. February, March, April, May, June, yes, sorry, 5 months. And so it was time to go home. And I left the boat in Tanawa thinking, well, by next spring, of course the pandemic will be over. But it wasn't. And in fact, Japan kept its borders closed all through the summer of 2021 and didn't open up until October the 11th, 2021. I flew in on October the 12th, but by that stage, it was late in the season and I had other commitments back home, so I only just came back to do some maintenance for a week or two and didn't sail that year. And then in 2023, everything was opened up again, and I sailed for 3 months, slowly westwards through the Seto Naikai, the inland sea, out through the narrow strait at the west end, the Kanmon Kaikyo, sailed down the west coast of Kyushu, did lots of cruising around in convoluted circles, and ended up back leaving the boat for the following winter, 2023 to 2024, in Fukuoka. And then finally, this year, left Fukuoka at the end of January and sailed for 5 or 6 weeks with a Japanese couple who are friends of mine, down from Fukuoka, west coast of Kyushu again, and then the island south, all the way down here to Okinawa. And my plan for probably, well, I shall leave here next week and then probably clear out of Japan and Ishigaki to the south within the next 2 weeks sometime. And then finally, all being well, make it to the Philippines. Yeah, so I'm going to base the boat in the Philippines now for a couple of years.
Right.
This year will just be a year of getting there. I'll leave the boat for 9 months out of the water, and then next year I'm hoping to sail January, February, March, just a slow cruise down through the Visayas, the central part of the Philippines, where there's a huge mass of islands there, probably out to Palawan, and slowly, without a time rush, move down to southeast Mindanao and then leave the boat in Mindanao until the following year.
Right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Francis. He also, just as a bonus, he showed me how his compass in the cabin is oriented. So I'm going to end with that clip so you can watch it as well. Quite interesting. Thanks for watching. I'm back on my boat now, considering and assessing all the options for me in the future. I've written an ebook about my experience in Hawaii and lessons I've learned of having to resign myself to certain realities. So that's to come as well. Check out the Never Too Late Academy, resources, videos, and you can find some of my other books there as well if you're interested. So thanks very much. Fair winds. And remember, it's never too late. Bye.
So this is a wonderful spot for watchkeeping. The boat sailing itself, normally obviously with a wind vane. I can sit in the companionway here. I have a little seat and a cushion that slot in here. I have good visibility all around. I can bring the spray hood down behind me here if the rain's coming from behind. It's dry, good visibility. And I can see my instruments at the chart table. Before I had that big plotter, I had this compass installed, which enabled me to see the compass from my companionway seat. And normally, when you look at a compass, you're sighting down the line of the boat, and you look at it from aft forward, and it indicates the direction that the boat is heading. But in this case, I'm looking at the compass sideways, because it's out there on the starboard side, and I'm in the center line of the boat. So I had the compass offset by 90 degrees. The compass card was moved 90 degrees. So as we look sideways across that compass, looking out from one side of the boat towards the other, it's saying about 120 degrees. That's actually the direction that the ship's head is pointing.
Right.
I haven't been caught out, but the people who come on board get a bit puzzled by it.
Great. Thank you for having us on Plainsong.
Great pleasure.